Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. So, now that I have introduced my theory of revolutionary worldview warfare, we can start analyzing some different scenarios and situations. Today's analysis will stay at the collective level, so that means we'll be looking at social engineering. Remember, social engineering deals with cultural dynamics and population dynamics. The population under consideration will be working age Americans. That spans roughly from age 15 to 65. I conceive of culture as having 7 fundamental pillars. They are philosophy, art, religion, law, politics, science, and economics. The pillars of culture under consideration for today's analysis will be economics and philosophy for the most part, to a lesser extent, politics and science. The situation we're going to analyze today is a podcast discussion I had a few months ago with John Coleman on the American education system. I thought it fitting to have this discussion now since most high schools, colleges, and universities are entering summer break at the time of this recording. I'm going to let the podcast introduction play and then interject at times to analyze what John is saying in the context of social engineering. Then I'll move the podcast discussion along. So let's get to it. We're about to jump off the porch into this wild, wild west, otherwise known as the American education system. Load up. It's just worldview warfare. Today we have John Coleman. We're going to give John a chance to introduce himself here real quick. But first, just want to thank everybody for joining again. This is going to be a very interesting podcast and hope you enjoy. So John, give everyone a little introduction to yourself.
Sure thing. Well, first off, Don, thanks for having me on here. I look forward to our talk. During undergrad years, I was asked to teach part-time in a local school, which a lot of the families were coming out of homeschool. And so this was a brand new school. And, the years went along and it developed, but unfortunately, the people there didn't really seem to have much of a vision beyond their own immediate needs for their own children. And as time went along, too, my own pedagogy developed and so forth. And so in the spring, actually, of 2014, I started Apocatastasis, which is, as I say, an alternative college and high school. So basically, we teach at the collegiate level, anyone about 15 years of age and up, and we have people all the way through their 40s and 50s. I guess we would say, Donald, that apokatastasis, which the word is a Greek word, it means restoration, by the way. It's I guess taking the best of both worlds, if you like. It's taking the best of the democratic aspects of homeschooling or of alternative education, but also the best of the academy, I like to think. Because, alternative ed as well as the mainstream in whatever grade level or college level, they both do things very well, and they both do things respectively very poorly. So my work here is I suppose to preserve the best of both and to get rid of the junk from both.
Okay, I really like the institute and the name. It just something about it just strikes me as this is a serious place. Learning is going to take place here. One thing that I was wanting to know is when we talk about the education here in America and the younger generations coming up needing to be ready for certain types of jobs and things like that, how would you say that your institution is doing things that other institutions are not to prepare the generations to come?
I believe that much of modern pedagogy, whether that's the mainstream or, for that matter, largely aped in the alternative world, I'm sad to say, is predicated too much on, indeed, the assumption of a job. If education has a social role, which I believe it does, then that role should be towards encouraging entrepreneurial ism, I guess. We might say in the humanities world, agency, which I think is much the same. The individual able to act in their own life. And much of the educational models that we've inherited, they are assumed very heavily that the individual, that the student will eventually go and work for another. And so to answer your question there, in terms of practical skills, very little, but the much richer substrata, this soil from which to grow, I think, is to encourage in the students individual agency, and that the individual would feel confident taking economic control of their life. To be blunt, I think the job model, which a lot of education is geared towards, is a very dangerous model for a man to be in.
The discussion is about to start touching on technique. Recall that technique describes how humankind's faith in technology and culture for survival is passed down through the generations. Technique comes up again and again in this discussion, and it's going to manifest primarily in two ways. First is through pedagogy, which deals with philosophy of education and psychology of education. The second way is through the job model or job system. This deals with customs of production and trade and ownership. That's very interesting. Like, okay, so please elaborate on that part, because my question kind of assumed something, and now that I see that Apocatastasis is not geared towards that particular end, why would you say that training people for jobs is not a good idea?
Yes. So, and where I would focus in on in particular is indeed that job idea. It's certainly work training can be very valuable. I was just in preparing for this, reading an article about firemen's education. So, to take our scalpel to things, it's this idea of the job system that I'll elaborate on, a system which has been imposed on us over the last 150 years. And that is where a man doesn't have access to, say, the capital of his labor. So perhaps he works in, do people still work in factories? We'll say he works in a factory. He doesn't own the tools. If he works in a school, he doesn't own the school. If he works in a shop, he doesn't own the shop, etc. And so there's this dependency that the individual finds himself in adult life, which is dangerous because he exists in his job at the pleasure of another. And that's a very vulnerable spot to be in. And it's allowed society to be steered because we've been unmoored from ownership in our capital, that is to say, where we work. It's allowed society, as we're seeing in a
Mm-hmm.
thousand ways over the last year,
Right.
people, they don't have the ability to push back just on that material level. And so, both for individuals and for societies, for neighborhoods and towns, it's not a solid place to be in.
Yes, and as you were speaking, one of the things that I thought about was the Amazon situation that's
Mm.
happening currently down in Alabama. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm envisioning like basically Amazon in which it's ran by the people. So the people in the community set up a warehouse. They own it, and they are the ones fulfilling the orders that people put into the website, correct? Now the zeitgeist is about to come into better focus. Recall that the zeitgeist represents the overall spiritual, social, and mental disposition of an era. The era we are looking at here is 20th through 21st century West, mainly the United States.
Yeah, exactly. Much more decentralized. And, before all of these generations have been run through the modern educational system, which I see really does a really great job of removing the individual's desire for agency in their life. That is the self-government, shall we say. People more and more get used to being told what to do. Before all of that happened, just as an exact example on the Amazon, you had in the 30s and 40s here in America and Europe Europe, in South America, etc., you had attempts to do this where the workers would hire, this sounds insane to Americans, but the workers would hire their bosses, or the bosses rather would basically manage the building. They would make sure the gutters were clean and the bills got paid and things. But it was a complete inversion as to what ultimately developed, which is where we're all by the throat.
Okay, when was this taking place in Europe? What time period?
Oh, 20s and 30s. And very often
Mm,
this would be called distributism. A lot of this ended up getting steered into the fascist movements, and so it got
okay.
discredited and so forth. But I would caution of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, that the naked idea itself is not a bad one, nor is it inherently a fascist idea.
Okay.
Yes, so what I was describing was what sometimes is called the third way or distributism. And it came out of actually a lot of Christian thinking at that point. And in many respects, I suppose it echoes a type of democratic socialism, but it is a different. It's coming from a different tradition, a much earlier Christian tradition, almost a monastic tradition. If you go back to the monasteries and things like that.
Okay. This is something that fits within our system that we have, and that basically is just a rethinking of the way we envision earning a living.
That's fair to say, although I guess we'd have to hash out what is our system, because I see it as being totally at war with the ideas of individual autonomy at present.
Now, propaganda is about to come into better focus via the philosophy of individualism, for example. Notice how certain forms of individualism are promoted through the society's education system to get citizens to act in the economic interest of the society's rulers. Individualism is promoted, but it's a certain type of individualism that it's in a
Mhm.
way it ends up working against certain people, and a smaller group of individuals take most of the rewards.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe free enterprise would be a better word to use than capitalism, because as I see it, at least, that that what capitalism has gone through so many retoolings, including right now with Mr. Schwab and Mr. Malay and their Great Reset. This is their newest one, stakeholder capitalism. But at the end of the day, the common denominator over the last 200 years has been that the worker doesn't own their capital. It is true that there are different types of capitalisms, but what do you think about that?
Yes, that is very helpful. I've heard free enterprise before. Now I can better situate this. So please continue.
Yeah, so the other question that's outstanding that you had there, Donald, was the reception up in Connecticut. And I I often joke between sobs and tears. I often joke that over these last 7 years, we're moving now after Easter time into our eighth year. I joke, but don't joke, that I've really learned to have almost a PhD in human psychology and in social dynamics, because
Mm.
you learn a whole lot, when you're doing this sort of work. I mean, to make one's own school, one's own learning space might be better, because we very often just use the parks and the cafes and so forth for individual classes,
Okay.
and a lot of online, Zoom classes like everyone else, or whatever the case may be. To answer your question, what was the reception up here in New England? You get a lot of people that they like the idea of Apocatastasis, a certain level of informality, however, hoping to avoid the type of mom and pop atmosphere, which I think is too tolerated in homeschooling. And they like the idea of maybe the social critique or the economic critique. So they see that. They see the local thing, and then very often they see the larger society, Donald, that
Another layer of propaganda is about to be exposed here via the psychology of fear. Notice how a society's education system prepares citizens to act on fear in ways that promote the economic and political interests of the society's rulers.
this past year, and the malleability, the Play-Doh that Western societies have proved to be in the face of a very few 100,000 people who are shifting things in a very clear direction with a very slight pretense of medical fear, properly speaking, using a lot of scare tactics to shift things. I mean, this is the proof of what modern education has done to people's psychologies and to people's confidence and so forth. That you just need Mr. Gates and his pastel sweater to snap his fingers, and the whole world changes.
The environment of fear that has been created, you're linking that with the way people have been educated, such that
Hmm.
the way a society is educated on the whole makes them more or less susceptible to certain type of information campaigns.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, and just to corroborate that point, I think what we saw in America during November and December and January.
Underneath that fear mongering we just discussed, we are about to see wicked deception come into focus for a brief moment. Most of us know that there is still a lot of confusion surrounding this pandemic and the pandemic response. But where do we draw the line between truth and lies?
And what I'm going to say is not partisan. It's just, I think, just an objective observation. There's nothing of partisan politics here, but I think what we saw was a true psyop that was run. I would watch the news, and it was info wars, to use Mr. Jones's title. I mean, it was just bombardment and
Yes.
just shoving through the present administration and a whole worldview that comes with that. And they were just going to grit their teeth and just like a quarterback, just shove right through. And that's what we saw. And people's mental worlds are not they're not able to make connections to things. There's the local thing. People can see it. They can see it in abstract, to get to your point about the reception of the school in Connecticut, but I think we apply it to also the recent historical event. They can see the local, they can see that, they can see the big picture, but that entire swath of culture and of social action and so forth, to act on it, that is what we're missing.
We're about to see the focus shift back to technique here as mainstream pedagogies battle against alternative pedagogies. Or when you say action, what would that action look like?
There was a book called The Benedict Option, and this was written by Rod Dreher. And Rod Dreher had suggested that the culture could not at this point be saved. I think he was writing in the Obama administration. And I suppose that I'd agree with him.
Mm,
There was going to be no, like a lot of evangelicals in the 80s with Jerry Falwell and things. They had thought, if we can seize the levers of power, particularly political power, we can turn
yes,
this thing around.
yes.
Um, Dreyer, 20, 30 years on, he said, no, this is not going to happen. The only solution would be to do what St. Benedict did in the 5th century, and indeed to drop out. And if enough people drop out, perhaps a new culture could arise. So I think there's some of that going on. There are some intentional communities or communes or whatever they want to call them that
Mm-hmm.
people try. But I don't think most people, in my experience, I don't think they have that sort of a vision. I think they act somewhat on their observations, and then they sit on their laurels.
Okay.
And the larger agenda is excellent at co-opting movements. And not that I'm saying that homeschooling is being co-opted or this sort of thing, but are you familiar with the imagery of the Borg from Star Trek?
Yes, I am somewhat.
Or the Blob is another one, right? John
Okay.
Carpenter's Blob. The image is enough. I think we get it, where people break out, and then this agenda, this society, some people get off the reservation, so to speak. It swoops around and lassos them back in. There's a great analog to this in the counterculture of the 1960s. It starts out very socially minded, very politically minded, and ends us just by the 1970s, 1980s, ends up just being another demographic you can market things to. And homeschooling, I'm afraid to say, from the majority of people, and I would also say unschooling too, which is a kind of a niche within that world, it's largely lost a lot of its sociological and cultural and political consciousness from the 1970s and 80s. And it too has, much like that counterculture, of which it actually, in a sense, kind of was. I don't think we associate homeschoolers with being the counterculture, but actually they very much come out of that soup. It's really just become another demographic. It's convenient, but I don't think that community has the same metal that we'll say their parents or grandparents had.
Now we are about to shift focus back again to propaganda. We discussed active propaganda earlier, but now we are about to see sub-propaganda more clearly. Notice the ways that a society's education system affects citizens' thinking long after they finish school. Pay special attention to this thinking in regards to authority, connecting dots, time management, and self-worth. Wow. Okay. So I'm just thinking about how focused we have to be in order to create a better life for ourselves and our children. This takes a lot of thought and clarity and a real purpose, because there's so many ways to get sidetracked. And it also, I think, speaks to the cleverness of the system, that it's able to adapt to different opponents and then find a way to neutralize that opponent. And so what you're saying here has really got me thinking. It's incredible. So when you say that the way in which people are educated turns into how they conduct their lives on down the road, and people might not make that connection. When I finished high school, for example, I felt like, okay, that part of my life is over. Now I'm going to move on to transition into something else. But from what you're saying, certain things that we learned that we weren't explicitly taught, but we were implicitly taught, they stay with us even though we're finished with high school. High school has nothing to do with what we might be doing in our day-to-day life, but there are certain things that we were taught are influencing the way we live.
Yes, and I should say before I answer that point or respond to that point, Donald, that insight that you're coming to in our discussion here is something I've had the pleasure of being on a few podcasts this spring, and each time the host has realized that, and I've also in my own personal conversations with people had the pleasure of really, pointing out that vista. Once you realize the influence of education, you see it in a thousand ways in day-to-day society, in political happenings, in cultural happenings, and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
And so to elaborate on that, the modern educational system, a system, let us get off all of our high horses, a system which has largely been taken into private school and homeschool. It's the same system that I'm critiquing. A lot of people, they get kind of hung up on what is taught in the classroom. Whatever the books that are chosen for literature, maybe different scientific controversies, or sex ed or whatever. That I suggest is missing the deeper work, the deeper teleos of education, modern pedagogy. Pedagogy is kind of one's philosophy of education. And to a certain extent, what is taught is irrelevant. That the real work of this system is to create very atomized people. So, what are some proofs of this that we take into our later life? One of which is to listen to strangers without any qualifications. People show up in the classroom year to year, semester to semester, and we learn to just to follow what they say because that's the system, and you're a child, and that's how it goes. What we don't want this to do is just stall out into a type of sophomoric anti-authoritarianism. But there is a certain aspect that, again, we can see writ large over the last year, where people who are perceived as authority figures are listened to unquestioningly. So that is one point.
Okay.
Another would be the temporal aspect of education and how that affects later life. So, one of which is that modern education breaks things up into categories: mathematics and natural science and religion and PE and home ec. I don't know if anyone does home ec, but you get the idea. And this is, by the way, what, modernity has done. And inherently, it's not a bad thing, because those demarcations can allow people to dig almost infinitely deep into a subject, that sort of specialization. This sort of specialization is, in a sense, the genius of modernity, because it's allowed unbelievable progress in certain areas of human knowledge. However, one of the downsides, whether that's in the big sense in modernity or in the way that's implemented in school, mathematics and literature and English and so forth, is that the person who's trained in that system has no ability to make connections between one subject and another, which I think is crucial to understanding my point that a lot of people are not able to make the connection between their own individual observations and the larger agenda, because the subjects are divided so sharply, and indeed the teachers are changed out semester to semester, year to year. There's no connection being made in the mind of the student to different subjects. And so all of life in later years stays in these neat categories. And the larger symphonia, the larger connection, the symphony of life is lost. Another point on the temporal aspect, the aspect of time. How does our interaction with time change in modern education? We are trained in a principle which this economic system is obsessed with, which is to think about the future. Everything is in the future in capitalism. Everything is, at the end of the quarter or at the end of the day, what are the receipts? Everything is in the future. When's my pension coming up? When can I plan for my 401k? Everything in the economical system is in the future, and we see that mirrored in the classroom dynamic, right? So we study for the test in the future. We work on the essay. Ultimately, we need that degree. What's my GPA at the end of the semester? And so there's a training. There's a training which happens to never actually exist in the present tense. You're constantly existing in the future tense.
Mm.
The last point would be somewhat related to the future tense point, and that is that modern education, much like modern capitalism, puts the cart before the horse. And what do I mean by that? So, in this economical order, of which I'm sad to say education has become the servant of, in this order, the object or the service is not the point. If I work at Arby's, as I did for a number of years in my earlier life,
Mm-hmm.
the beef and cheddar sandwich is not the point of that work. In this order, the point of that work is to get paid, is to get money. If I make furniture, the purpose is to sell the furniture to make money. That might seem peculiar to critique, because it seems like 2 + 2 is 4. Of course, you work for money, but actually, if you look at human existence, you work usually for the object. If you make a plow, you go and use the plow. I don't think people realize how disordered in terms of human experience the idea of working for money or for some remuneration is. And so bringing that to the classroom dynamic, why do you study, little Timmy? You study for the test.
Mm.
Why do you read the book? You read for the book report. Why do you get straight A's? It's not for the knowledge that those letters are supposed to signify, but it's for the GPA. And so it's the same principle, that the goodie is why you do something, not the actual thing itself. And so there's a type of Pavlovian conditioning which is very obvious to see in the structure of modern education.
What you've outlined, I'm sitting back and I'm thinking, this is social engineering.
Yes.
And it is so clear that it's social engineering, and it's such an effective system. And it's like, wow, hats off to the rulers. They know what they're doing. And it's effective for maintaining control. Very much so. I mean, I also think about the dissatisfaction that people feel in their life, that revolves around this hey, we got to get out here and get this money, and the ways in which that ripples into other aspects of life, in which people feel like money gives them value as a person. They don't have, or they don't feel valuable as a person if they don't have a certain amount of money. Or one of the things that I think about is the whole concept of the six-figure man, and
Mm,
how, once you cross over that, then okay, now life can begin. I could start my
mm,
family. I could do this. I
mhm,
could do that
mhm.
now, because I've hit this goal of six figures, and I will feel successful, and society will judge me as being successful once I get to that point. That's so deep. I mean, for lack of a better word, man, that is such a deep thing right there. When you spoke earlier about apocatastasis, the idea coming out of the monastic tradition, that made me think about the Celtic monastery tradition, how in early Europe, much of the learning in general come out of that monastery tradition in Ireland very long ago in early Europe, and how it set the stage for Europe to really, a lot of the developments in science and things like that come out of that. And so this way that apostases is laid out is something that does work, and it just, the people you have to be educated on how to be educated.
We are about to see the focus shift back again to technique in regards to the political and economic obstacles that make it difficult to fight against problems in a society's education system. And then on the technological front, we are going to get into the growing issue of cyber warfare and how it fits into a larger scheme of revolutionary worldview warfare.
Congratulations on Apocatastasis making this 8-year mark. This, just what I understand about entrepreneurship, it's tough, and the first few years make or break different ventures. And for y'all to have 8 years, that says a lot. So hats off for that. But where do you think we're headed as a society?
Oh, wow. I'll start little and then grow out. How's that?
Okay.
I think with the past year, people are more willing to think outside the box. So that's good. That's great. And certainly there's been an uptick, Donald, in correspondence and students over the last year. I think exactly for that. Part of the social critique of the school, part of just the honesty of things is that I'm absolutely adamant that the school will not be registered with the legal system and therefore the banking system. So in terms of the nitty gritty, I think it will continue to be difficult to get tuition around, to order things. You have no idea how difficult it is to do these things without a bank account and a tax number and all this nonsense. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so in terms of nitty gritty, because the system is obviously trying to consolidate all economic traffic through the banks at present, that's going to continue. That's going to get even more difficult. I do not believe this pandemic experiment will run its course without the internet at least going down for a certain amount of time,
Hmm.
if only to test what the reaction will be.
Okay.
So that we have provisions about that happening, especially for online classes, you can imagine.
If I could, John, just for a second,
Yes.
when you mentioned that you think that the internet there's going to be some disruptions just to see what will happen,
Mhm.
why do you think that is going to be the case?
Because I think this order, well, certainly this political order, it knows it's on the outs. The only question is whether China will replace it or whether these giant tech systems will replace the order. Too many people are finding out about this. They were finding out over the last 20 years. We've seen the internet shut down. In the Arab Spring in Egypt in 2011, all of our jaws hit the floor when the so-called third world Egyptian podunk government was able to shut off the internet through all of Egypt. We've seen the same thing in Taiwan and elsewhere.
Revolution is about to really come into focus here. Notice how internet addiction exploits young citizens' desire for self-gratification. Also, notice how a society's rulers' desires for self-glorification are being exploited in their pursuit of utopia, which is a part of the great work I discussed in the previous episode.
The young people that are, addicted to the social media, if the internet was to just go down, that would be life or death, literally. Would you say that that would be kind of like a last option?
In the instances that it has been used, that I followed yeah, it was used there when clearly the state was losing power altogether, and it was one of a number of red buttons. Where my mind is, if you really want to take things there, Donald, I believe the ruling class of this world is insane. And I'm not being funny when I say that. I believe they're mad. Their generals sit down to talk about fighting wars. They're just talking about like online wars, hacking, weather war, and all this stuff. So in the big picture, I think that besides a nuclear option, so to speak, of cutting off the internet in a crisis, like I think just to take their numbers to see how people would react. How do the suicides go up when we turn off TikTok? How does how many old people, how many of them die? I think a lot of what happened in Texas was some of this. So it's a dark way to think, but every piece of data, every evidence, every words out of these people's mouths indicates for me that it's not beyond them to think like this, 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 to think like this.
Yeah, although the discussion was about education, what we ultimately ended up talking about was social engineering, which is revolutionary worldview warfare on the collective level. Like I said in a previous episode, revolutionary worldview warfare is a system of systems. Can you start to see how the Zeitgeist is a system, technique is a system, propaganda is a system, wicked deception is a system, and revolution is a system? Also, isn't it interesting how the great work started to come into focus at the end? As I do more analyses in the future, you will start to see a pattern that whatever specific case of revolutionary worldview warfare is analyzed, it ultimately feeds into a larger agenda of social utopia and personal godhood. I really hope you enjoyed this episode. I have a lot of interesting things in the works, so please stay tuned. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.